Temple life was the buzzing center of activity, as you know. People walking in every direction, livestock galumping all over the place. No clue that they were on their way to temple sacrifice and that they would be singing "I Surrender All" in just a few minutes. There are people dropping coins in the horn-shaped offering receptacles, people dropping their free will offering or their temple tax. Some folks are buzzing around, walking fast with purpose. Others just strolling and hoping to be seen. There were a group of folks in the text that precedes this one. The story right before this one is about a group that was strolling around the temple, always hoping somebody would see them. They were the scribes who liked to walk around in their long robes and be admired by people. The temple was a place to be seen, and the scribes would walk around the robes, the symbol of their importance, and folks would, in fact, people would even stand when a scribe came near, kind of like we do when a U.S. president enters into the room and everyone stands. The scribes enjoyed that kind of prestige. The only people that got a pass were the working tradesmen. They could keep laying bricks. They didn't have to get up. Everybody else did. Their robes declared their position in society. It got them good seats at every gathering. They got to sit at the head table. If we're honest, they were living the life most of us aspire to. Banquets and head tables and respect. They weren't buzzing and moving. They were just kind of walking around, hoping to be seen. And if asked to pray, they were hoping to be asked to pray. Because if asked to pray, they would give long prayers that underscored their obvious piety. But there were others. There were so many people around. Other people scurrying and buzzing off to work or to prayer or to sacrifice, running past the temple to go home and grab lunch. All of this activity. And in great contrast to all of this activity, to all of this hurry, Jesus sits in the court of the women and watches people making their financial contribution. And as Yogi Berra once said, you can observe a lot by watching. Now, I'm an incurable people watcher. I can sit and do it for hours. And there is something fun about watching a group of people do the same activity and how many different ways people will do the same activity. My grandfather and I were on a bench one time at the mall during Christmas season watching people get on the escalator. That will amuse you for hours. But there's some people who treat it like a metronome. They stand, everybody's backed up behind them, and they time it, right? So they get it just right for fear that one misstep, everything. Then there are other people, same activity, who never even look down. They just walk along, and right? They'll adjust. Their foot might hit wrong. They'll adjust. Same activity. Jesus sits across and watches these people who are doing the same thing. They're just going by to put their offering in the horn-shaped place where the offerings were received. But he's watching in a way that he wants to observe something about human nature. And Jesus is the master at paying attention to human nature, to looking at the surroundings and drawing insight. For instance, in chapter 2, you remember he knew that what the scribes were grumbling about. Later, he knew when a woman reached out to him in desperation. He knew what the disciples were quietly arguing about on the road. He was an observer of the human condition. And here he is sitting and watching people come by, and he's making these insightful conclusions about people's character by the way they handled their money. And by listening closely, he could hear how many coins were dropped And you can if you listen closely. One morning I was in a hurry and went to grab a breakfast sandwich in some coffee shop or some little ham and cheese, egg, something. I was in a hurry. I didn't know, didn't care. I was in a hurry, and this woman was not. And when she finally handed me my sandwich, I handed her a $5 bill, and I was out the door. I said, whatever's left, put in that little glass jar by the register, and I'm going. Well, on the way out the door, I heard her say, your total has come to $4.94. And I listened closely, and you're right, you can hear nickel clank, penny cling. She dropped them as if to say, well, thanks for help with feeding the kids. But you can hear it. Jesus is watching and listening. And some people would come by and they just hurriedly drop off their money. They're on to something else, no connection between their offering and their living. Some would stop and whisper a prayer and make it a real offering, a gift of worship that they were giving back. But then he saw those guys with the flowing robes, the ones who sit at the head table, the ones who are in every issue of the Atlanta Business Chronicle, the guys that are at the reserved section seating in the synagogue, those guys. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them would make their offering in the loudest way possible. They dump coins in, and you could hear them clanging and dumping, and people are lined up waiting their turn, and it's if they're saying, can you hear all this jangling going on? That's me. That's my offering you hear. Yep, all those coins clanging around, that's my offering. It's going to take a while. Sorry to hold you guys up. It'll be a while. That's my offering that's going in. And Jesus is watching this, just fascinated by what he's observing about human character. As he watches people approach the treasury in all of these different ways. And then as he's watching, this woman walks up. She's one of the unnoticed people. She's one of the people most folks ignore. She's a poor widow, which is actually redundant. Because in that culture, if you were a widow, you were poor. Your husband's assets went back to your family of origin, not to the widow. A widow might have been given family assistance, but many of them had to turn to begging. A poor widow was about as redundant as saying a poor homeless person. She's not somebody the scribes would ever notice. There's no indication that any of the disciples noticed this woman, but Jesus does. Jesus watches as she pulls out this tattered change purse, dumps all of her money into her palm, and she only has 2 coins, 2 mites, which is the smallest denomination there is. It is 1/64th of a day's wage. With only 2 coins to her name, she quietly drops both into the horn-shaped treasury and then skips home. Now, you're right, the text doesn't say she skips home, but I'll tell you later why I think she skips. We know how the story ends. We've heard it 100 times. We just read it again a few minutes ago. But I think we ought to stop for a minute and be honest if this story is ever going to do its work on us. Because there are at least 2 things that keep us distanced from the truth of this story. The first is our instinct to think that what she did was not noble, but crazy. I mean, who in their right mind gives away everything? If she had given 1 mite and kept the other one, we would still think she was a little bit kooky. There's a part of us that wants to say, sweet widow, feed yourself first. The temple doesn't need your money that much. And besides, who gives away everything. And so how do we take this seriously if there's a part of us that does not admire her? And there's a second issue too. We do admire scribes. We do admire people who have buildings named after them and who get to sit at the head table. We do admire the people who've given tons of money away for good causes, and we celebrate the press they get when they have given money away for something that matters and something that's good. So if these things are true, how are we supposed to hear a fresh word today? How do we hear the truth of this story in a way that actually matters to us, that changes something within us about how we do our living? Well, back to our story. Jesus is observing human behavior, watching all the different ways people make their offering, and he notices this woman that nobody else notices. She takes her last 2 coins. And after he sees this, he calls the disciples over and he tells them the story of what he's just watched. He says she's put in more than all of those who've contributed, because the others gave from their abundance after all of their needs were met. After they were sure everything else was taken care of, they gave the leftovers to God. But this woman gave everything she had to live on. Now, I mentioned that I am a lover of observing people, but I am a novice observer. Melissa kind of makes fun of me because I can sit for hours in a crowded place and just watch the people do what they do. I'm fascinated by how people carry themselves, by how they carry their security or their insecurity, how people dress and what they're hoping to communicate by what they dress. Sometimes I just don't you want to stop and ask people, what were you thinking you were doing today? I saw a woman one time at Six Flags who had heels on. And I wanted to go back. Did the Six Flags thing come as a surprise to you? Did you not know this is what you were doing today? I love to watch people like the married couples who communicate with nods and grunts, a language they've learned in shorthand after decades of being together. I'm a novice observer, but I share an observation with the late Robert Horton, who said this. He said that the greatest lesson he learned in life was that people who set their minds and hearts on money are equally disappointed whether they get it or whether they don't. Jesus' observation is that those who gave what they could afford were caught up in the lie that they were secure. And you and I know they were afraid. They live in fear because they fear that there is not enough and they have to get theirs right now. They set all of their hopes for security and peace and joy on how much they can accumulate. And so they are equally disappointed whether they get it or not, because it's still a life run by fear. But the widow who has no accumulations can only live in trust. She can only live in the trust that God, the God to whom she gives her money and her worship, is her source of hope. She gives her only 2 coins, but not her last 2 coins. This, I think, is the key to the story. She has given her only 2 coins, but not her last 2 coins, because she knows 2 more coins are coming someday soon. It is the ultimate trust fall. She is trusting that the extravagant God who has seen her safely to this good day will provide again. She has thrown her trust into a relationship that is more secure than the Dow Jones Industrial. Because the one who saw the Israelites safely to the promised land, the one who makes and never breaks covenant, is the one she is throwing all of her trust to. She gave her only 2 coins, but not her last 2 coins. More will come. God provides. Her worship and her offering is the ultimate statement of her freedom because she believes in an extravagant God. She believes not in the security of accumulation. And ironically, she is freer than any of those who have placed their hope in money. And that is why she skips. You can only skip if you're free. Besides, having enough money to give away is always elusive. Some people are waiting until they have more money so they'll have some to give away, which misses the point. Because the story's about trust. It is a trust issue, not an affordability issue. For those who seek security in accumulation and just offer a tip when the offering plate comes by, they're playing a game that is an endless, breathless search to be self-sufficient, financially secure, just a little more, and the clamor for just a little more while we plop a few coins into the offering plate and run home to see how the market closed is a sad and breathless way to live. John D. Rockefeller Jr. said, "The poorest man I know is the man who has nothing but money." Well, the men with the flowing robes who sit at the head table stroked modest checks out of their accumulated wealth, and it really didn't cost them much. They still had their house in the Hamptons. They gave because they wanted people to see how much money they could give and still didn't need. And the widow gave as a way of showing her complete devotion to the extravagant God whom she trusts to provide next month and next month and next month. So I return to my earlier question. How might we be shaped by a story that seems too far-fetched to be relevant? Are we supposed to hear this story and give everything we have away? I don't think so. We have in this story 2 extreme symbols of selfishness and trust. And we're called to live with more trust in God and less in our accumulation. We need to get real about the folly of believing that our security is in our assets and grow toward a life of trusting in the goodness and provision of God so that we might truly be free once and for all of the sense that there's not enough. You know that it's stewardship season. Right after church, many of you are going to the banquet that follows. Others of you are going home this week and next to talk about what you're going to give to the 2016 budget, what you're going to give to the endowment campaign. This story challenges us to get beyond the question of what we can afford to give. It compels us to consider what kind of gift would symbolize a trust that our security and hope is not in the Dow, but in the God who created us and calls us into loving, trusting relationship. That courage to move from fear to trust is the ultimate free fall. It's the shift from believing that our hope is ultimately in God and making that move, making that internal move is the only way we will skip home. how will you respond to the call of God? Will you stand and sing together and respond as God leads you to your next step in discipleship?